Welcome to Ignite Intimacy, a podcast exploring intimacy, romantic relationships, sexuality, and everything that relates to these hot topics. We're going in. Are you ready? This is your host, Laura Aisha. Let's do this. Okay, let's just take a moment before we dive in here just to feel our feet firmly planted on the ground, and wherever we're sitting, whatever we're sitting in or on, just feeling the support holding us up. Gravity, the support of a chair or the floor or the couch, and just knowing that we're held in this space. And as we turn our gaze inward, just to connect and bring our breath together, giving thanks for all that is, all that was, and all that will be, for us coming together in this time and allowing us to be the clear channels that we be in this world and in this moment, just allowing whatever is needed to be received by anyone who will ever listen to this podcast episode to just channel through us with ease and grace and clarity and truth. And let's take 3 nice big deep breaths in and out together. Take a nice big deep inhale and exhale. And inhale and exhale. And inhale. And exhale. All right. Yeah.
Beautiful. I can stay there all day.
I know. It's like hypnotic. Cool. Rachel Halder, so good to have you on Ignite Intimacy today.
Yeah, thank you. It's so good to be here.
Yeah. So Ignite Intimacy community, we're experimenting with just sharing a little bit more about what we do before we press record, when we're getting ready to record guests for the podcast. And usually it starts with something like what you just heard. So welcome to this episode, another juicy, amazing, insightful, explorative, curious conversation on Ignite Intimacy. And I'm super excited to have Rachel Halder on the line with us today.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really excited to be here. I was listening to a bunch of the podcasts yesterday and I was like, this show is so awesome. So
Yay!
I feel very honored to be a part of it.
Oh, that's great. That makes me really happy. Yeah, I'm sure there are some folks that you know on the podcast, and I frequently have guests who are like, yeah, I saw like several of my friends featured on your podcast, which is great. So, so we're going to be diving into some really interesting topics today, a lot around sexuality and spirituality. And we've certainly covered this topic in past podcast conversations. However, this is a deep dive, topic. There are so many twists and turns to sexuality and spirituality, with the uncovering of sexual abuse cases in the Catholic Church and in other religious sects, and in, you hear about sex cults, and you hear about just, all of these different things that sort of enmesh, not sort of, they absolutely enmesh sexuality with spirituality and the sacred, and then you've got just like heaps of guilt and shame that come along with a lot of that, and unfortunately a lot of it revolves around sexual abuse of underaged individuals, children, by people that they were taught to trust. So we will be diving into that whole world, and we'll also touch into racism, classism, and how it all intersects with sexuality. So, what do you think about that, Rachel?
I think it sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, so let me just give you a little background on Rachel, or Ray as she's referred to as well. So Ray is a sacred sexuality specialist and empowerment coach, helping spiritual seekers remove shame and blocks from their sexuality, reigniting passion and pleasure in a deep, holistic, and integrated way. With an MA in religion, she extensively researched sexual and spiritual healing through neuroscience, trauma recovery, and embodied interspirituality, focusing on holistic healing for those marginalized or spiritually traumatized by the Christian church through LGBTQ plus identification and or sexual suppression or abuse. So, Rachel, thank you again for being here on the line with us today for this important conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm honored to be here, and I love having this conversation because I think it's something that everyone recognizes is something, but that people don't actually talk about very much. Like it's kind of amazing how little people talk about like religious shame around sexuality.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's such a huge topic that has absolutely permeated the fabric of our society all over the world. Like, I don't believe that I think every society has been impacted in some way by this collapse of spirituality and sexuality, and mostly not in the most empowering ways. So
Right.
so talk to us a little bit about, how did you get into this? Like, what was your experience in life that you said, I want to study religion, and then I want to study the intersection of sexuality and spirituality?
Yeah. Oh, well, it's kind of a long story, so I'll give the very condensed version. But I grew up Mennonite, and so that's not Amish. Most people, when they hear that, they're like, "Oh, you were Amish." I'm like, "No, no." Like Amish actually broke off from the Mennonite, and they're much more conservative than Mennonites. But Mennonites are still like, it is like its own little community. It's very different. I mean, it's like hard to compare to things, but I like, if I have to compare it, I would say it's almost like growing up Jewish, or growing up like in something that's kind of a more like otherized community, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very insular, and like all Mennonites know other Mennonites. Like we have this thing called the Mennonite game. When you meet a Mennonite, you're like, "Oh, where are you from?" "Oh, I'm from Akron, Ohio." "Oh, do you know so and so?" "Oh, yeah, I do know so and so." So it's like a thing where like there's like a second degree connection to every single Mennonite in this country, basically, for me. And so I grew up Mennonite, grew up in this insular community, and I experienced sexual abuse first when I was 3 years old. Not by anyone in my family. It was sort of a strange situation where it was a person from Honduras who was escaping like war and persecution, and he was staying at my aunt's house. So he was kind of like a refugee.
Wow.
So that was my first like foray into sexual abuse. And I didn't remember that until I was 22, 23 years old. And when I remembered it, it was like kind of traumatic, obviously. And there was also just that feeling of like, why didn't anyone talk about this? Like, why did I never even hear like sexual abuse mentioned in the Mennonite church? Like, it was just like it was just invisible, basically. Like, it was just never, ever discussed. But then also, when I was growing up, when I was 15, I also had my first relationship ever with a 19-year-old that turned sexual very quickly. And obviously, power imbalance there. 19, 15, like never had sex. The guy who I was involved with had 9 sexual partners before that. So and I didn't realize this until I was like 25, 26, but that relationship was also highly traumatic for me. And it was strange because I couldn't identify that as traumatic for me, even though I had like discovered my childhood sexual abuse. And then I actually worked in like sexual abuse advocacy for years, like from like age 22 basically to 25, 26 when I realized this. But what I came to was that I didn't understand that relationship was abusive because of how deeply embedded the shame was for me for engaging in a sexual relationship. And when
Wow.
I talked to people about the sexual nature of that relationship, instead of them being like, well, this is like statutory rape, technically, like this is a definite power imbalance. Their whole concern was like, you shouldn't be having sex because you'll go to hell. So
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't like just the fact that, okay, like you really shouldn't be having sex with a 19-year-old because you're only
right.
15 and maturity wise, like, with the power imbalance that you mentioned, I mean, it's like it is statutory rape. It's not, kind of sort of anything. It
Right.
is. And, I certainly had relationships with older men, older than that, when I was a teenager and like before I was legal. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah, totally. And it was like, so once I came to this realization, it was so astounding to me how people like basically like slut shamed me instead of being like, wait, what's going on here? Because they were so concerned about my soul instead of being concerned about like the
Oh my
traumatic effects on
God.
my body, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah. So that like obviously made a powerful impact on me once I came to that recognition. And then within that recognition, things became a lot clearer. Like I was very, very avoidant of relationships. I was kind of prudish in my sexuality, like if we're going to label it something. Like I definitely like all through college, I like really harshly judged my friends who would like sleep around with people. Like I basically like cut off myself from my sexuality because, and I didn't realize it until I like came to this realization, but like I had basically decided my desire was a very bad thing, like it
Mm.
led to very, very negative circumstances. And I didn't realize like how embedded that like religious shaming of my sexuality was. And so, sure, like the physical trauma was something, but I actually feel like the physical trauma was much easier to work through than the actual shame that was just like in my cellular makeup at that point.
Well, shame runs pretty deep, doesn't it?
Yeah, runs so deep.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I'm still like navigating a lot of that I picked up from my own childhood and being raised in a Roman Catholic environment and with one of my parents having a lot of shame, energy and reactions around sexuality and just not even knowing that I could talk to anybody about it
right.
to like understand it better or understand what was going on with me and yeah, so that's a deep one to just kind of continually clear out. It's like you're just sort of like
Mhm.
continually like, clearing out that space where that shame has sat all these years.
Definitely. Yeah. It's kind of like that onion with all the layers. It's like you get one layer off and then you're like, oh, there's like 20 more layers here. But you don't
Exactly.
necessarily
It's like,
realize it until you
dang
hit it.
it, I thought I was done with that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that's sort of like the brief background for then why I became intrigued with this, because also simultaneously while uncovering my sexual abuse, I was also on a deeply spiritual journey of understanding more like what is my spirituality and really differentiating myself. I don't know if that's the right word, but like coming out of the Mennonite church, which even within that, it was amazing to me how much like, even in college, I never went to church. Like I did go to a Mennonite school, but like I didn't really even almost identify as Christian. Like I was really trying to figure stuff out and I had a lot of anger. Like that was like my anger years. And even though I like had pulled away and in a way, there were so many layers that I had to go through of like being comfortable being me, like after growing up in such an insular community. So that took years, and that was kind of simultaneously what was happening as I was uncovering all this sexual abuse. And what I recognized was like how deeply spiritual our sexuality was, and how like I was kind of horrified that like this part of me had basically been like taken away, or that's what it felt like to me, like that it had been like just stamped on, like that I didn't get the opportunity to have this deep connection of my spirituality and sexuality, because from day one I was basically told that my sexuality was a very bad thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where I kind of started really looking into spirituality and sexuality and what are the connections, and like looking at it from many, many different religious perspectives. So like I studied Tantra and Taoism and stuff, but I also looked at like ancient Christianity and like, what does this mean then? Like, when did the Bible get distorted? Like, when did people start believing these beliefs that aren't necessarily true? And so I really started digging in many different ways, and also looking at sex positivity in Judaism, and, just really exploring it from many different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I get that. And, I mean, it's a journey, right? It's like there's so many different avenues to spirituality. And, there's like religion, and then there's more spiritual practices. And then it sort of all gets intertwined with this sexual piece. And I'm watching the new docuseries about the ashram that was in community that was created in Northern Oregon back in the 80s.
Right. Wild, wild country.
Wild, wild country. It is, whoa, powerful. And actually, it's
Yeah.
so interesting because I was just in Mexico in February, and I met two people, one an American, one from the UK, who met at that community in Oregon in the 80s, and they were just reconnecting for it'd been like 20 years since they've seen each other. And they had first met living in that community in Antelope, Oregon. And what's so interesting to me, because I've also come across and crossed paths with people who grew up in like sexual cults, and just that whole world of, like I said earlier, collapsing spirituality with sexuality, and then there being no specific boundaries around age, and like older men being sexual with much younger women or children. And, so have you dove into that in your studies at all?
I mean, I have like skimmed over it. It definitely wasn't my focus, but I am very intrigued by it, and have certainly like read enough. And I've also watched Wild Wild Country. I was definitely all over that. So yeah, I mean, I've looked at it. I wouldn't say that was explicitly my study though.
Okay, yeah, because I'm just, it's when you look at sexual abuse, again, I don't think there's any community or society that has been untouched by older people being sexual with younger people. Mm-hmm. And, I'm just like, what's at the root of that as a human race? Right. Within our world, it just permeates society. And I wonder, I'm just curious, like, how will we be as a human race and as a world community when we have a transformation there? Mm-hmm. And there's like a mass healing of sexual abuse, because, there are people who are coming out, especially in Buffalo, New York. There's been a big, so I'm from Buffalo, and there's been a big insurgence of people coming out about priests in Buffalo that were abusive to them. And these are people who have lived with this secret for 30, 40 years. Mm-hmm. And they're grown adults, and they've literally missed a huge chunk of their lives because they've been living with this, this secret. And I know that you had mentioned when we first spoke that there was sexual abuse that was going on in the Mennonite church as well, that wasn't being like publicized. It was more on the hush. Mm-hmm. What were some of the things that you were learning or doing to bring that more into the light?
Yeah, well, like I said, when I first kind of realized my sexual abuse, the path I kind of went on was, well, not kind of, the path I went on was more sexual abuse advocacy work. So a part of that was that I was in therapy for my 3-year-old experience that happened to me, and I was flying, and when you're on a plane and you're like kind of half awake, half asleep, mm-hmm. and I was like in that like weird state, and I had this dream where I heard this voice, and it was like, you're not the only one, like in the Mennonite church to have experienced this. You need to tell your story. And it was, I mean, it felt extremely real to me. Like, it was just so pertinent. And within a month's time, I started a blog called Our Stories Untold, which was exactly that. It was a place for people in the Mennonite church or any Christian church, but like I at that point, it was more focused on Mennonite church, to come forward and to talk about their abuse experiences.
Wow.
And that was the first time that anything like that had been done in the Mennonite church. Like up to that point, it was actually pretty silent. Like, I mean, there had been like different people in the church, of course, who like there's a woman who had written a book, Carolyn Hagen, like she wrote a really great book about childhood sexual abuse and like the effects of that. But there hadn't been like a church-wide discussion about sexual abuse up to this point at all.
Okay.
And so in that, while like opening this up, so I had this blog for about 4 years, maybe a little longer. Just other people are running it now. But within that, what came forward was the reopening of this sexual abuse scandal that did happen in the Mennonite church with this man called John Howard Yoder, which was like the Mennonite like godfather, you could say. Like he wrote, like, so Mennonites believe in nonviolence, like they're pacifists, and he wrote like the holy book on like peace and nonviolence. And it's like the book that like a lot of people who didn't grow up Mennonite actually like became Mennonites because of. And so it's like this really powerful book that like has this deep influence on a lot of people in the world. Like I know a lot of people who were maybe Christian and other traditions, like converted to be Mennonite because of the power of this book. And the irony of it is that this man abused like 50 plus women during his life.
Gosh.
So he's writing about peace and nonviolence and is also sexually abusing women and guising it in that it's like a spiritual practice. It's like a like religious, like that it's important. And you know, I mean, I don't even want to like go down that road. I like see that, well, when you were talking about why is this, all of this, like my first thing is like repression. It's all about repression. And you know, like the weird twisted thing of like John Howard Yoder and like what he did to all these women is like, maybe he did have a point about like that sexuality was repressed and that like it needed to be it needed to be explored among brothers and sisters. That was like his whole thing. Like we're brothers and sisters in Christ, and like it's important for us to explore sexuality. But like he totally manipulated his position of power and you know used it and against very, very intelligent. So like a lot of the people he targeted were like very intelligent female seminarians, which at that time, like to be a female seminarian was a very vulnerable position just to begin with, like being a woman trying to become a church leader.
Yeah,
that's just vulnerable. And so he kind of like, you know, he like kind of preyed on these really intelligent women who like, that's like a very uncomfortable position. Like, how are you going to say no? You know, it's like, it's very confusing. And so, yeah. And then he also traveled around the world a lot. And so there's like women in countless other countries who have been abused by him. So this kind of all got like blown up again, you could say, like at the time, like it was sort of there, but then it really definitely got like pushed under the rug or under the pew, so to speak. And so having this come back up on the blog, like blew it up huge in the church and actually like forced the church to take accountability for it and to actually recognize like where they had massively gone wrong and like what are they going to do to prevent this in the future, that sort of thing. That
is really, wow. Yeah. Men in power, abusing their power. This is like, you know, a story that we hear so much about, and we're seeing so many more people get called out around this. And, you know, with the Me Too movement and just, I mean, what's in the news right now with so many business leaders and political leaders and, you know, church leaders, you know, it's, unfortunately, it's not surprising.
Right.
And it's also shocking. And when we actually have the opportunity to be really transparent and clear about what we'd like to do or what we want to do or the space that we want to create, and then giving others an opportunity to say yes or no.
Exactly.
You know, and so instead there's like this mass manipulation that's being presented with, you know, being a leader and having that power and having people look up to you and having people, you know, address you in such ways and either feel like they want to be as close to you as possible or that they don't want to say no for fear of being, dismissed or shut out or hurt in some other way, possibly physically or otherwise.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, you touched on it, like consent. Like, I feel like consent has been so out of the equation for so long. And it's interesting. Like, I've studied a little bit of Betty Dobson. I think that's her name. Is that her name? Who does like the wheel consent.
Oh, yeah.
And it's really powerful. And it's just, it's amazing because even with like the very little that I have studied that, I now walk into just any kind of circle. So like spiritual circles or even like medicine ceremony circles. And I like start examining the space from the lens of consent. And it's incredible to me, like how much consent doesn't happen. And like, even if it's not around sexuality, how like there is like so much pressure or like force or obligation or just not even the space for people to be able to consent. Like, it's just incredible to me how this is so not a part of most spiritual conversations, and how I really do feel like that's like kind of like the next wave, like especially the next wave of like Tantra and Taoism, like, which is becoming, so much more regularly like it's kind of like the new yoga. I feel like people are like more open to it at this point in our society. But I feel like what really needs to come with it is this culture of consent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just did a quick Google search. It's actually Betty Martin who is responsible for the wheel of consent.
Thanks for looking that up.
Yeah. So we'll include a link to Betty's work in the show notes. And I'm just wondering if you have any recommendations for books or other resources that supported you as you were discovering the abuse that you had suffered as a child, just so that our listeners have somewhere to go, so sort of a next step if they're in a similar situation and just sort of like discovering any sort of abuse that has happened in their lives.
Yeah. What was I? It's interesting because I was in Indonesia when I like first remembered my sexual abuse, and I was like living in Papua, which is very, very rural, like no English speakers, barely any English speakers. So I didn't actually have many resources. I had a lot of contemplation and a lot of meditation. And then I actually did live in an inner spiritual community for a couple years. And the same there. I feel like honestly what helped me get through it and get through it so quickly, like I'm not, there's still layers, of course, but like actually move through it in this really deep, intentional way was being like having the space to process it. So like being able to meditate all the time within community, being able to go on hermitages, like being able to like do a lot of like cathartic, somatic releasing, that sort of thing. But there is a book, I didn't read this until like after the point, but it's called The Mosaic Mind. And it's about, it's this modality called internal family systems, which is something that I have studied, and it's a therapeutic modality. And I love it. I think it's really transformational for a lot of people. And so the Mosaic Mind is about sexual abuse using the internal family systems lens. I'll try to look up who it's by really quick.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's always great to give some resources, especially as we're talking about sexual trauma and sexual abuse. And I'm just also going to see here. Let's see. So there's also a safe helpline that you can call, which is 877-995-5247. That's a sexual assault hotline. So again, the number is 877-995-5247, and highly recommend that if anyone is dealing with the remembering of past trauma and abuse or something that has happened within the last 24 hours or more recently, please get professional help and make sure that you've got a support system to guide you through the process of healing. And we're sending so much love and light out into the world for all of the people in this universe, past, present, and future, who will deal with sexual abuse and sexual trauma. And we'll have links to the Mosaic Mind and the Wheel of Consent, and also the sexual assault hotline in the show notes as well. So those will all be there, that you can find resources in the show notes. So I'd like to shift the conversation and talk a little bit about racism, classism, and how it all intersects with sex and sexuality.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'm certainly not an expert on this, but it is definitely like a passion of mine and just something I really try to be intentionally aware of, especially as a white woman who grew up in the middle of Iowa, which is not exactly the epicenter of diversity. And so this is something that I definitely have, like, I try to create awareness around it, and I strive for more awareness and more awareness around it. So one thing that I am very passionate about is ecosexuality. So understanding nature and how that plays into our sexuality as sexual beings, and like how the two are so interrelated, and how we can actually have this sexual relationship with nature, which probably sounds weirder than it actually is. And when I started really like feeling into this, what I also started like thinking about and discovering, and then probably picking up like writings on, was the decolonization of bodies and the process of the colonization of bodies, and recognizing how this intersects with Christianity, because, that's essentially what Christianity did. It was like, how can we control bodies? How can we actually, and I don't know if this was deliberate or not. I kind of like, imagine like some men sitting behind like a closed door, like having this discussion. But I think unintentionally, it was 100% deliberate, like in this unconscious, unintentional way. And whether or not people were actually like scheming about it, who knows? But it's like a deliberate way of being able to control people. And it's like, if we instill a culture of fear around people's bodies, which is where we live in as human beings, like we live in our bodies, and we should have like full autonomy over those bodies. But if we instill this culture of fear, like these people are much more easily controlled. Like we could control them.
Yep.
And so essentially, I mean, I think that's like what rape and sexual abuse and all of this does, is it takes away that person's autonomous like knowledge of their body, and like the safety that we should feel inside of our own home, like inside of our body. And so then recognizing how like the abuse of like Black women and like women coming from Africa, like the slave trade, how rape and sexual abuse was used in such an intentional way, and in really like just, horrifying ways. And how that, like, again, misuse of power, but also just manipulation, and like, how can we control these people? Like, how can we dictate the way they feel about themselves, the way that they operate? And then that like goes into our culture. And so I believe like the way that African women were treated in the slave trade, like absolutely breeds to the way that Black women are viewed in our society today. So the way that we sexualize them, the way that we think about their body, and indifferently think about their body compared to white women. But then this also happens in indigenous communities. I know that Native American populations here in the United States have the highest sexual abuse and rape and missing persons. So missing women. It's the highest population of missing women in the United States. And like that comes from this colonization of bodies. So not only did Columbus come over here and like get the land, but like they actually literally colonized people's bodies. And so what I'm really interested in now is like, how can we decolonize our bodies, and what does this mean? And what does this mean when we look at the intersection of race, and when we look at the intersection of nature? And I keep bringing in nature because I actually feel like that is some of the key. And the way that we treat the earth, like the way that we just like rape and pillage the land, the way that we set up fracking. I mean, maybe I'm getting too political here, but the way that we do all of this like damage to the earth is absolutely, in my mind, a direct correlation to what we have done to women's bodies for so long. And the fact that we consider Mother Earth a mother, and that means we can just like shit all over her and like not care, like, and that she'll just love us no matter what. It's like, nah, that's like not okay. And so if you think of the earth as lover, like, would you really be doing that to your lover? Like, would you really frack your lover? Would you really like just shit on your lover and expect them not to care? Like, I don't know. There's like this also, that whole like mother dichotomy, and what that has been created to mean in our culture as well. And what that means for a mother's body, a sexual being or seen as a non-sexual being too. So yeah, lots of layers here.
Oh my goodness. There are so many layers, and I am thinking like a thousand things are running through my mind at the moment. I'm thinking about motherhood. And as a mother, I have a
Right.
20-year-old daughter, and every woman relates to motherhood in a different way. And some women are just like so into being mothers, right? It's like their raison d'etre, it's like their, everything. And some women don't want to be mothers at all. And some women have children and they abandon them because they, for whatever reason. And some women are as present as they can be as mothers and they love their children dearly. And they also have their struggles with motherhood. And then, we've got mommy and daddy issues
Mm-hmm.
from being born to parents who most likely had issues like every human does and were dealing with their own stuff and their own relationship to themselves and each other and the family and the children and society, and then all the trauma that's been passed through the generations
Mm-hmm.
around families and parenting and motherhood. And so I have also been I've been waking up to my own ignorance about my own privilege and the trauma that, our Black and Brown brothers and sisters have experienced here in this country and around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I, I've been started a project called Inclusive Conversations with Karen Fleshman. She's based in San Francisco. I'm based here in New York. And we have been bringing white women and women of color together to talk about racism and white privilege and the issues that tend to divide us, ultimately so that we can come together and rewrite history, as a united front.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was recently, sometime over the last 6 months, I was referred to Dr. Joy DeGroy Leary. And I'm not sure if I'm saying DeGroy correctly, but it's Dr. Joy DeGroy Leary. And I'll have a link to a YouTube video of hers. And she has been educating people about post-traumatic slave disorder. And I
Mm-hmm.
highly recommend checking out this video that will be in the show notes because it goes deep into the sexual trauma of Black women
Right.
from the slavery days and how there were literally no laws that protected Black and brown skinned women from rape.
Mm-hmm.
And that allowed the perpetrators to carry no guilt or any wrong feelings about perpetrating sexual abuse and sexual trauma on women of color in this country. And so it's a very powerful thing to wake up to and to realize the foundation of sexual abuse and sexual trauma and sexual assault towards women of color in this country and that date back to the slave trade. And then, speaking about our indigenous brothers and sisters, that dates back, further than that. So this is a very powerful, powerful topic. And it's something that I am just committed to continuing to unpack so that, I can continue to educate myself, develop more empathy for the communities of color in this country and around the world, and also for the communities and of all people who've suffered any level of sexual trauma in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that recognition that you just had, that like the foundation of this country was built upon this like deep sexual abuse and sexual abuse against minoritized people, like not by their choice, but by the people who were in power at the time, who just decided like, no, this is mine. Like it's like, so it's just like, I know it's within me. I know it's a part of me and it's a part of my history. And I'm still like astounded on just how like egotistical and just, yeah, it's hard. It's a hard reality to face. And it's hard to recognize like, oh, I contribute to this too, because I live and work and act within this system as well. And the system has been built upon that abuse. Like that's
Yeah.
basically like how we, like how this country became what it is, like because they took people of color and used them as slaves. So it's just, it's a really deep subject. And I encourage everyone to start unpacking it. Like you said, it's sometimes hard to wrap your mind around. There's, speaking from white perspectives, I know there's like white guilt, white privilege, all of these different things can come up. You can feel shitty. You can feel all the feelings. And I think it's just so important to just let yourself feel those feelings, but keep going in, like keep digging in, because nothing can change unless you're willing to recognize that this is a part of your history. This is a part of our history as a collective. And we just have to feel those feelings and keep going and keep processing, keep reading, keep exploring different experts, like keep educating yourself, like keep going.
Absolutely. And what I want to acknowledge is that it started way before the slave trade in this country.
Definitely.
And, the Spaniards and the folks who came over to and stumbled upon America, they raped and pillaged the indigenous people and the earth of these lands, well before the slave trade. So it's like you have like that whole experience, and then you've got the whole slave trade experience. And so it's like, I mean, when you look back at our culture here in our country and our society here in America and in the United States, and you look at, how it came to be that we're here and the laws that were put into place to support white people and to suppress people of color, it all becomes very, very real. And another resource I want to share with our audience is the Scene on Radio podcast. Scene as in the scene of a play, SCENE. Scene on Radio podcast has a 14-part series called Seeing White. And it takes you all the way back to the origins of whiteness. And it brings you all the way through the slave trade and the Constitution and, into redlining and then we had an inclusive conversations event, and my co-creator Karen Fleshman was sharing with us about, the term is not coming to me, but where there were just communities and states across America where people of color were not allowed to be in those communities or some states after dark. And so, there are stories of people who were traveling across the country by car, and they would just have to keep driving because they literally couldn't stop, and for fear of their lives. And, it is beyond disturbing. So we all need to know the real deal history of this country and of the Americas. And by knowing, we have an opportunity to develop more empathy and compassion, to open up these conversations with our families and our children and our communities, and really just like be a part of the acknowledgement, that this actually happened, and then discovering ways to heal and to come together as a country and as a world community.
Definitely. Absolutely. And I just want to touch on one last thing within this whole topic, because when you're talking about the laws about, can't be in this city, this state after dark, there's also the whole component of the rape and the black man, and how that was such a, what do you want to call it? A like false story that was created to have fear around men of color, that they like would rape you, or that they're these monsters, or that they do these things. And that was like a whole other layer that I also see definitely playing out in today's time as well. And I just think it's important to bring that into awareness, because that, it has deep effects on masculinity as a whole in this country too. I mean, a lot of this is talking about abuse against women, but I just wanted to bring that component in.
Thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely. The abuse was suffered so deeply on everyone involved, male, female, or otherwise, like it permeates a society. We see the effects of that today, hundreds of years later, and today slavery still exists. It exists here in America. It exists in our neighboring countries. It exists all over the world. So, it's important for each of us to take a stand for equality and the healing of the trauma that has been suffered by massive communities across this country and across the world. So this has been super powerful. Wow, Rachel, I'm just so grateful that we had an opportunity to dive into these big, important topics. And what I want to express, I want to just, connect with our community right now and just say, these are not easy topics to hear about, learn about, talk about. There's been a lot of trauma, that we as a society have experienced. And so if something is coming up for you through the topics covered on this conversation, please get professional help. Reach out to people in your community. The sexual assault hotline will be in the show notes. And again, it's 877-995-5247. And, I'm just encouraging anyone who is just feeling, a trigger by this conversation or something that's being uncovered for them, please get professional help and deal with what's there. And because there is so much beauty that lies beyond the trauma. And I just love you all. And Rachel, I'm so grateful for your presence today on the podcast and for having an opportunity to have this important conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Is there time to just say one last thing?
Of course.
Okay, yeah, because I was like, well, okay, so this is like ignite intimacy, and I know that like a lot of this conversation was really kind of heavy. You could categorize it as heavy. For me, I enjoy digging into the why of everything. So for me, it's just important. But I just want to acknowledge that there is so much joy and passion and light and energy that comes through going through the trauma healing journey. And that's truly the work I do with people. And like, we didn't even get into like embodiment of your sexuality and how to heal that. But like when you ask book recommendations, Peter Levine's work with trauma resolution work, that's sort of been like my holy Bible of this lifetime in healing my own sexual abuse, and just want to acknowledge that there is another side. And so, I've done this long journey and still am uncovering layers, but I can have really pleasurable sex now. Like I do have this really deep relationship with my body, and I also see how that's developing each and every day. And so I kind of want to end this with a note of hopefulness, and that like intimacy is absolutely available. And I think it's actually going into these shadows that brings that intimacy out. Like I believe that uncovering the shadows is what ignites the intimacy on the other side.
Absolutely. It gives us access to intimacy.
Exactly.
Like choosing to take the warrior path and the warrioress path and go into it allows us to just create so much of a deeper connection with ourselves and with each other so that we create space for more intimacy in our lives. And I'm so glad that you shared that. So Rachel, where can people find you online?
Yeah, well, my website is just rachelhalder.com, Halder. I'm sure that'll also probably be in the show notes. And there, you can go to rachelhalder.com/ebook. And I have written a free book called Sacred, Sexy, and Whole: Undressing Purity Culture, Redressing Redemption. So if the religious components was very interesting to you, I recommend downloading that. I also go really into trauma healing, trauma theory, like how can you heal through embodiment? And I even give exercises that you can do. So that's a great resource. And you can find me on Instagram at The Sacred and the Sexy. I'm on Facebook, again, The Sacred and the Sexy. I have a Facebook group that women can, or female identifying humans can join. It's called Sacred Sexuality Sisterhood. So yeah, there's lots of different avenues that people can find me.
Awesome. Yep. We'll have all of those links in the show notes. Again, it's rachelhalder.com and the last name is If so, it's Rachel, Rachel, Halder, HALDER.com. We'll have all of these links in the show notes, including a ton of resources for you. So thank you, Ignite Intimacy community. We are in this together. We have each other and we've got life and we've got a lot of love in our hearts and in our communities. And let's just keep fostering that love, and, I'm here as a commitment and a stand for more love and more connection, healing and transformation beyond the trauma. So enough love and respect, everyone. Check us out, igniteintimacy.com. And if you have any questions or you want to holler at us, give us a shout. hello@igniteintimacy.com. We love y'all. We really give thanks for you and stay blessed. We will see you on the next one. Ciao for now. Thanks for tuning in to another conversation on the Ignite Intimacy podcast hotline. We love that you choose to spend your time with us. Check us out at igniteintimacy.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes and leave us a review and a rating. It helps more people know about us. We love to hear from you. You can email us with questions, comments, or suggestions to hello@igniteintimacy.com. And tell your friends. Music was arranged by Jason Pfaff and Mike Corey, and this podcast is produced by yours truly, Laura Aisha. Thanks again, and we'll see you on the next one. In the meantime, let your light shine bright and ignite your intimacy.